Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an editorial from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This editorial evaluates the draft population control bill that has been brought out by the UP government. We covered the provisions of this draft policy the day before yesterday, and if you remember, we discussed that the UP government is targeting a replacement level fertility of 2.1 in order to achieve population stabilization in the state through this bill. Replacement level fertility is nothing but the total fertility rate at which the population will start replacing itself. TFR, or total fertility rate, is the average number of children a woman has in her lifetime. And if the average TFR of a country or a state is 2.1, which is referred to as replacement level fertility, then the population will start stabilizing, as each couple would be providing for their own replacement by having two children on an average. Currently, UP's TFR stands at 2.7 as per the National Family Health Survey 4, which was released back in 2016. Whereas states like Bihar, they fall behind UP, and as per latest data from the National Family Health Survey 5 of 2020, Bihar has a very high total fertility rate of 3.1. Here I would like to refer to our discussion that we had the day before yesterday, and I would like to issue a correction with regard to Odisha's total fertility rate. During that discussion, I had incorrectly mentioned that Odisha also has very high TFR along with states like UP and Bihar. So kindly allow me to correct this error, as Odisha's TFR is not as high as that of UP or Bihar, and Odisha has managed to achieve its replacement level fertility of 2.1. But apart from that, we had discussed the provisions of this draft bill the other day, which is seeking to help Uttar Pradesh achieve replacement level fertility of 2.1, along with promotion of modern contraception, especially male contraception. And this draft policy is also looking to decrease maternal mortality rate, that is MMR, and infant mortality rate, that is IMR, of UP. This editorial carries out a more detailed assessment of this draft bill, and it looks at the scheme of incentives and penalties that the policy has designed in order to achieve population stabilization by cutting fertility rates in the state. This draft policy of Uttar Pradesh proposes a set of incentives to those who have just one child or two children, and these incentives include perks with regard to government schemes and government welfare programs, along with special rebates and subsidies in taxes and in availing loans, accompanied with cash rewards to those who are adhering to the one child and two child policy. On the other hand, the policy also proposes a set of harsh penalties as a disincentive to those who are having more than two children. These penalties include denial of government subsidies through government welfare programs, denial of government welfare benefits, and a prohibition on applying for government jobs and as well as on contesting elections. Just like Uttar Pradesh, even the state of Assam is pursuing a similar policy of incentives and disincentives in order to encourage family planning and reduction of fertility rates as a part of their strategy to achieve population stabilization. But the editorial labels this policy of Uttar Pradesh as a policy of coercion and points out why such policies usually fail in achieving the targets and the objectives. Such coercive policies of incentives and penalties has been tried and tested by several other states back in the 1990s and early 2000s. States like Unified Andhra Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Haryana, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, and Odisha, they have all experimented with such coercive policies which provided for a set of incentives and disincentives as penalties in order to achieve population control. But time and again, these coercive policies have failed to achieve the desired results and have actually had several unintended consequences. Considering the coercive nature of this policy, even the National Human Rights Commission has denounced such measures. And to understand why, one just needs to look at China's experience with coercive population control policies. Since the 1980s, China strictly enforced population control policies such as a one-child policy, and even this was modeled on a set of incentives and strict penalties. This coercive family planning measure did not yield the desired results for China, And even though it managed to achieve population stabilization, it achieved it in an unhealthy way, which today is having unintended consequences on China's demography. Today, China is left to deal with an aging population, and in the coming years, it is going to face a shortage of workforce. And in the process of implementing this course of policy, the human rights of several citizens has been violated, along with the violation of the right for informed choice that any individual should enjoy in a modern civilized society. After realizing that this course of policy was pushing China towards a demographic disaster, China has quickly made a U-turn in the recent years, and it has not only relaxed these family control policies, but it has also started encouraging Chinese couples to have more children in order to address the demographic challenge. In fact, empirical studies around the world have clearly proven that such forceful and coercive population control strategies are always ineffective, and they not only fail to achieve population control and population stabilization, but instead they will end up discriminating against the marginalized and vulnerable sections. Because those who struggle with family planning are always those families which are extremely poor, and couples tend to have more children, and the family size tends to be larger only when the family is not financially secure, and only when women in the family are not empowered. So the editorial points out that this is more of a socio-economic challenge, and hence population control cannot be achieved through such policies of coercion and disincentives. The editorial points out that such policy of coercion with regard to cutting fertility rates is based on the neo-Malthusian approach. See, Malthusianism was a concept that was brought out by Thomas Robert Malthus, who was an influential English economist in the 1700s and 1800s. He specialized in the field of political economy and demography, and under his concept of Malthusianism, he proposed the idea that population growth is potentially exponential while the growth of the food supply or other resources is linear. That is, as long as food supply and other resources are available, population will continue to grow exponentially, and eventually it will reach a point known as Malthusian catastrophe, where the available food resources will not be sufficient to match the food security needs of the growing population, thus eventually triggering a famine or a war, following which the population will start to fall. Under this concept, it was proposed that in order to avoid this event known as the Malthusian catastrophe, one needs to enforce coercive methods of family planning and population control. Based on this, the neo-Malthusian approach has been built, which is nothing but the advocacy of human population planning to ensure that enough resources and environmental resources are available for the current population and as well as for the future population. But this policy has been criticized by several experts, including feminists, liberal thinkers, and free market experts, as they find this policy to be coercive and violative of human rights. And more importantly, it is seen to be counterproductive with regard to achieving population control. Instead, such coercive neo-Malthusian approaches, they will only end up targeting the marginalized and the vulnerable sections, that is the poor families. Hence, the editorial is asking the state governments to focus on the principles of the Cairo Consensus, which was achieved in 1994 during the Cairo International Conference on Population and Development. Under the Cairo Consensus, countries committed to focus on promoting reproductive rights by empowering women and by promoting universal education in order to achieve improvements in maternal and infant health care. So by this, what we need to understand is that there exists a direct link between poverty and high fertility rates. The problem of high fertility and population explosion is not just a demographic problem, but unfortunately our governments have always seen them as a demographic problem. This problem is more a problem created by poverty, and there exists a vicious cycle over here. Poor families tend to have more children as a means of securing the future financial stability of the family. And in turn, the high fertility rate will push the family further into poverty as it cannot afford the basic necessities such as food, education, healthcare, etc. As these large families struggle to find employment and livelihood opportunities, they are further pushed into poverty, thereby establishing this vicious cycle. In order to break the cycle, what we need is not a policy of coercion and not a policy of incentives and disincentives. Instead, we need socio-economic empowerment through welfare programs. Through economic reforms and through government welfare schemes, if you address the problem of poverty and if you create enough labor opportunities and employment opportunities, if you improve the financial status of families around the country, and more importantly, if you empower women to make an informed choice about the size of the family and contraception, and along with this, if we promote male contraception and promote maternal and infant health care, automatically the family size will start coming down and we will be able to effectively cut fertility rates. See, back in 2003, the Supreme Court had upheld a similar law of the Haryana government which prohibited those with more than two children from contesting local elections. When this law was challenged for its constitutionality, the Supreme Court upheld the law, declaring this condition to be constitutional. The Supreme Court said that the governments are well within their rights to place such conditions with regard to elections. But despite this ruling of the Supreme Court, the point is, these laws might be constitutional. Governments might have the right to place such conditions. But however, the question is, are these policies truly effective in reducing fertility rates? Then how about the impingement of informed choice that happens through these policies? So keeping all these factors in mind, the editorial concludes that socio-economic empowerment is a better alternative to coercive policies in order to cut fertility rates and in order to achieve population control. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, which evaluates the impact of the upcoming 2026 delimitation exercise on Indian federalism. In previous sessions, we've already discussed what is delimitation. Delimitation is nothing but the drawing up of the boundaries of constituencies for assembly elections and Lok Sabha elections. See, the current composition of the Lok Sabha and the current representation that it holds hasn't been changed since 1976, and currently the number of seats that have been allocated to different states is based on the population data of the 1971 census. After this, the population changes in the states have not been taken into account as far as Lok Sabha representation is concerned, because there has been unequal population growth amongst Indian states. In fact, this discussion is even related to what we discussed under the previous article. As we discussed, the smaller states of India and the more successful states of India, they have largely become developed and prosperous, and they have been able to reduce their population growth by successfully implementing family planning measures, and they have already achieved population stabilization. Whereas on the other hand, the backward states and the larger states, they have fallen behind with regard to family planning and population control, and as a result, there is a clear imbalance in the population of these states. Now, this is an important factor with regard to delimitation, because under a national delimitation exercise, the Lok Sabha constituencies are drawn up on the basis of population, and hence delimitation was frozen until 2026, which was the target year for India to achieve population stabilization. So now that this deadline is approaching, the writers take a look at the continued population imbalance between the smaller successful states and the larger backward states, and how this is going to significantly affect Indian polity and as well as Indian federalism. Because in this context, if a delimitation is carried out as per census data of 2011 census or 2021 census, then definitely the larger backward states will get more seats, that is more representation in the Lok Sabha, thereby making them more politically dominant, which will allow them to define the national discourse and as well as corner most of the economic resources. This is where a dilemma has arisen for the smaller states and the successful states. In fact, even during the recent deliberations of the 15th Finance Commission with regard to distribution of financial resources, the more successful states had brought up this issue. States like Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Karnataka, etc., they have achieved more economic progress through efficient governance and successful policies. And they not only contribute more tax revenue to the central pool, but they've also managed to stabilize their population. But in return, they get lower allocation, whereas the larger backward states receive a higher allocation of financial resources accompanied with a greater representation in the Lok Sabha. So, this is the core issue that the writers are trying to raise in this article. They believe that if the upcoming delimitation exercise is carried out as per current census data, then the most successful states will be punished, both politically and economically, and they will stand to lose their political influence at the center, and they will also lose out on their financial and economic resources. Whereas the political and economic representation for the larger backward states will further increase significantly, thereby causing a seismic shift in the Indian parliament and as well as in the Indian polity. This will give rise to a very unique and challenging situation for both the center and the states, because a clear divide will emerge between the more successful and smaller states and the larger backward states. So, in this context, the writers call for a better balance between democratic principles of the Indian Constitution and the federal principles of the Indian Constitution. Because there exists an inherent contradiction between the principles of democracy and the principles of federalism. See, in a democratic setup, all citizens are supposed to be given equal rights and equal representation in governance. But because of the nature of federalism in India, the larger backward states are getting a higher representation, thereby making them politically and economically more powerful as compared to citizens in the smaller successful states. So, this is the inherent contradiction in the constitution that the writers are pointing out, and hence they're calling for a complete reimagining of the concept of Indian federalism in the constitution in order to strike a better balance between democratic principles and federal principles. See, as you know, the first article in the Indian constitution states that India, that is Bharat, shall be a union of states. Here, the choice of words has been made very cautiously and deliberately by our constitution makers in order to define the Indian Union and as well as specify the nature of federalism in India. It essentially indicates that several states are coming together to make up the Indian Union. But however, in the interest of national unity and national integration, the Indian Union has been made indestructible, whereas the states themselves are destructible. And unlike in other federations, there is no separate state citizenship, there is no separate state constitution, and clearly these measures were included in order to make the Indian Union stronger in the interest of national unity and national integration, thus making India a quasi-federal setup with a unitary bias. But at the same time, the federated units, that is the states, they have been given their own jurisdiction following the linguistic reorganization of the states in 1956. The States Reorganization Commission decided that language is the sole basis on which the Indian federated units could be divided and effectively reorganized into administrative governance units without compromising on India's national unity and national integration. Even after this linguistic reorganization of 1956, several new states have been formed, and there have been several statehood movements as well. And every statehood movement since independence is bound to include a linguistic, cultural, and ethnic angle, as India and the Indian states are diverse, and there could simply be no other way of reorganizing the Indian federated units. So eventually, such reorganization on linguistic lines has created an inherent contradiction within the Indian constitution and created a divide between the smaller and the larger states. The higher population of the larger backward states and the process of delimiting constituencies on the basis of population has given them higher representation at the national level, thereby making these states more politically dominant and economically influential. While on the other hand, the smaller successful states have lost out, and despite contributing immensely to the national economy, their political clout is quite minimal, and they have received the rough end of the deal with regard to redistribution of financial and economic resources as well. So, on this basis, the writers are striking a note of caution because if the upcoming delimitation is carried out on the current population data, it will result in a catastrophic shift in Indian federalism, which will largely favor the larger and backward states, whereas it would end up leaving out the smaller successful states. So, this emerging divide is going to threaten India's national unity and national integration, as it is bound to give rise to resentment in the smaller successful states. So, to address this upcoming challenge and to strike a balance between democratic principles and federal principles, the writers are calling upon the center and the states to work out a better compromise with regard to the manner in which the Indian Federation has been created. Now, if you contrast this with, let's say, the US federalism, their model is slightly different and provides for a better balance between democratic principles and federal principles because through several compromises, the federated units have been given a higher set of powers and a higher degree of protection, which prevents larger states from dominating over the smaller states. Specifically, there are four measures in the American Constitution which ensures this protection for the smaller states. First, national power over the states has been limited. The federated units have their own powers, which in many areas and in many subjects happens to be superior to the powers of the national federal government. Then second, each state, regardless of their size, they have been given just 2 seats in the Senate, thereby giving greater control for smaller states in political and economic matters of national governance. Then third, presidents are elected by electoral college, which means that they must win the states rather than winning the total national population. In the US, it is possible for a presidential candidate to become the president without even winning the popular vote. Examples include President George Bush and Donald Trump, who became presidents without winning the popular vote because they managed to win the states. Then, back when slavery existed in the US, the slave owning states, which had not conferred citizenship to slaves, they were allowed to count the slaves as well for the purposes of representation. But after this inhuman practice was abolished, the US Constitution continued to strike the same balance between democratic principles and federal principles by protecting the political and economic rights of the smaller states and by preventing their domination by the larger states. This happens to be the very bedrock of the American Constitution, which has been worked out through serious compromises and through better balancing of power between the larger states and the smaller states. Something similar can be seen in other federations as well, such as Switzerland, Belgium, etc. But the Indian Federation is a very unique federation, and while it provides for a quasi-federal structure with a clear unitary bias in order to ensure national unity, it also provides for a set of jurisdiction for the states. Yes, the states have been empowered through their own autonomy on state subjects that has been provided under the 7th schedule. The states do enjoy their own jurisdiction with regard to finance, taxes, governance, and administration. But yet, when it comes to Lok Sabha representation, there is a clear imbalance between the smaller and the larger states. So the population imbalance between these states has resulted in compromising the democratic principles of citizens of the smaller states, thereby creating a crisis for Indian federalism with regard to the upcoming delimitation exercise. The writers say that just by extending this freeze on delimitation, we won't be able to solve this problem because we will just postpone the crisis to some other date. The previous freeze that was applied on delimitation was for the same reason. But extending the freeze cannot be the permanent solution because you'll be just postponing the problem to some other date in the future. So instead, the writers are calling upon the central government and the state governments to completely reimagine the Indian constitution and the nature of Indian federalism to strike a better balance between democratic principles and federal principles. Hence, they are suggesting a few radical measures, which include certain protection for smaller states on the lines of protection offered to smaller states in the United States. For example, the powers of the center to reorganize the states can be curbed, especially with regard to smaller states. This will guarantee their integrity, and on similar lines, their political and economic representation at the national level can be guaranteed through the constitution itself. Then, more importantly, the role and composition of the Rajya Sabha needs to be reimagined, and on the lines of the US Senate, equal representation can be given to all states, thereby empowering the smaller states. And the current power asymmetry between Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha needs to be bridged to make the Rajya Sabha as powerful as the Lok Sabha as well. Because currently Rajya Sabha has very limited powers with regard to money bills and as well as with regard to holding the Council of Ministers accountable. So if the powers of Rajya Sabha are re-envisioned, and if the Rajya Sabha is put on the same footing as the Lok Sabha, and if its composition is altered, to provide greater representation to smaller states. It will help in striking a better balance between the smaller and the larger states at the national level. Then the debate that has emerged with regard to financial redistribution should be given more thought by the Finance Commission because the smaller and successful states have raised a legitimate argument that while they are contributing more to the central pool of taxes, they receive a smaller share in return, whereas the larger backward states are receiving a higher share, thereby creating a financial and economic disparity between the smaller and the larger states. Then finally, another serious suggestion would be to reorganize the bigger states and to break them down into smaller units. While these proposals have existed for many years, it has often been opposed on the grounds of national unity and integration. It is argued by the opponents of these measures that if they are implemented, it could threaten the spirit of national unity and patriotism. But however, the writers point out that this opposition doesn't hold good because by not correcting this imbalance between the smaller and the larger states, we are actually encouraging a divide to emerge in the country, which would become a real threat to the country's national unity and national integration. Also, in the past, the states have been reorganized several times, and even when the states were reconstituted on linguistic lines, the country's national unity was not threatened. So, there is no reason to believe that the implementation of these measures, which will accord greater political and economic powers to the successful smaller states, will lead to the erosion of national unity and integration. Now, let's look at this column from page number 7, which evaluates the current status of the Indian economy. See, recently, the National Statistical Office brought out the provisional estimates of annual national income for the financial year 2020-21, and as expected, it paints a very grim picture of the Indian economy. The impact of the pandemic and the lockdowns was expected to be reflected in this data, and the provisional data that has been brought out is in line with this assessment. While the agriculture sector has continued to register impressive growth despite the pandemic, the real worry lies in the manufacturing sector where growth has been subdued as a direct result of the pandemic and the lockdown. Even in the pre-pandemic era, there were structural problems in the Indian economy which was affecting manufacturing growth, and now the challenges have further aggravated due to the pandemic and the lockdowns. And as a result, key sectors such as trade, construction, mining, and manufacturing have all registered negative growth. But India's GDP growth seems to be picking up in the last quarter with a growth rate of 1.6%, which is quite impressive compared to the negative growth registered in the previous quarters. So these economic challenges has pushed the government to come out with various policies and stimulus packages in order to revive growth in the Indian economy. As the pandemic broke out, the government announced several stimulus measures, including the provision of easier loans and credits, and it also came out with several support policies to revive growth in the industry. While these policies and stimulus measures are needed, they largely fail to take into account the need to revive demand in the economy in order to revive growth. Because see, if you look at two important indicators, that is the Business Confidence Index and the Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, they clearly point towards low business confidence in the economy because industries and businesses have all scaled down their production due to low demand in the economy. This happens to be a direct result of the rising unemployment rate, which according to data brought out by the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy stands at 11.9% as compared to 8% in last April. So this rising unemployment as a direct result of the pandemic and the lockdowns has affected income levels. And as people are losing jobs and as they are left with less income in their hand, their purchasing power has gone down significantly, thereby having a direct impact on the aggregate demand in the economy. As the demand has gone down, the business confidence has suffered, and the scaling down of production by Indian businesses is clearly seen in the PMI index. This index tracks the extent of purchasing that takes place at the manager's level, and thereby it acts as an indicator of the extent of production in the industry. But this data indicates that there is low business confidence currently, and industrial production for meeting the needs of the domestic market has been scaled down due to extremely low demand. Whereas on the other hand, export-oriented production is doing well, And in fact, Indian exports have already staged a recovery. So this clearly shows that the problem that is holding back growth in the Indian economy lies with the lack of demand, which is a direct result of insufficient income in the hands of the people. Hence, the writer is calling for government policies which are focused on income levels so that the per capita income can be boosted, which will automatically lead to a revival of demand. For this to happen, the government should focus on not just the industries, but it should focus on the consumers as well. It needs to enhance their purchasing power by putting more money in their hands, and this can be done through welfare schemes and through large scale employment generation schemes such as Manrega. Next, on page number 6, we have a column in which the writer examines the manner in which the latest IT rules were notified by the government under the Information Technology Act. We have covered these provisions and the issues concerning this in detail on the 28th of May, and we have understood how these new IT rules seek to regulate OTT platforms along with social media and digital media platforms. Here, the writer raises the question of lack of transparency in the framing of these rules and the absence of open discussion and consultation with all the stakeholders while coming up with such important regulatory frameworks and legislations. Next, on page number 7, we have a column that deals with Section 66A of the IT Act. Recently, on the 6th of July, I had covered this topic in complete detail, and we had understood how this controversial provision continues to be used by police officials, even though this provision has been declared as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in the landmark Shreya Singhal case. So, in this column, the writer talks about the various steps that can be taken to ensure that these unconstitutional laws are not misused to target free speech and expression, despite its application being prohibited by the Supreme Court itself. So please refer to this video once and then go through the column. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: socio-economic empowerment is more effective than coercion in cutting fertility rates. In the light of the statement, evaluate the population control policies announced at the state level. The second question: examine the impact of upcoming delimitation of Lok Sabha constituencies in 2026 on constitutional federalism. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.